I don't care what your ticket says, people like you don't sit here." The words didn't come out as a whisper. They didn't slip out by accident. They were delivered the way a man delivers a verdict. Loud, certain, and completely without shame. The first-class cabin of Stratos International Airways Flight S1-114 was quiet enough that every passenger in the forward section heard them clearly. A few heads turned. Most looked away just as quickly. The man who said it didn't even bother to look up from his tablet, and the woman he said it to didn't flinch. She stood in the aisle in a charcoal gray hoodie, black jeans, and worn white sneakers. She had a leather messenger bag over one shoulder and a boarding pass in her hand. She looked tired. She looked calm. She looked like someone who had heard those words before, in different rooms from different mouths in different decades of her life, and had developed a particular kind of stillness in response to them. That stillness was not defeat. It just looked like it from the outside. What the man in seat 1A did not know, what no one in that cabin knew yet, was that in less than 11 minutes every screen on this aircraft would go dark. Every entertainment system would cut out. The air conditioning would die. The ambient lighting would drop from warm gold to the cold white strips of emergency mode. The hum of a living aircraft, that constant reassuring mechanical breathing, would go completely terrifyingly silent. 300 passengers would sit in the heat and the dark, some of them crying, some of them praying, some of them pulling out their phones and calling their families. And the man who had told her people like her don't sit here would be gripping the armrests of a seat he had stolen, staring at a black screen, realizing with slow and terrible certainty that the woman he had dismissed, the woman in the hoodie, the woman he had assumed didn't belong, was the single person on Earth capable of bringing this entire aircraft back to life, or leaving it exactly as it was. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know what she'd built. He didn't know that the algorithm keeping this 400-ton machine in the air had been written by her hands, refined by her team, and licensed to this very airline under a contract that bore her signature. He didn't know that the blue glow flickering at the edge of every engine nacelle on this aircraft was the visual signature of her software running in real time. He knew she was wearing a hoodie. He knew she was black. He knew she was standing in what he had decided was his aisle. That was all he needed to know. He was wrong about almost everything else. The chaos that followed, the grounded aircraft, the cascading delays across 3 major airports, the viral footage that would be playing on news networks within the hour, the boardroom decisions that would unspool across the following months like a slow-motion consequence, all of it began here, in this moment. With a woman standing in an aisle holding a boarding pass that read S-I-114 Seat 1A. Naomi Cole and a man who looked at her and decided she must be confused. She was not confused. She had flown this route 22 times in the last 3 years. She had negotiated deals worth more than the entire fleet of this airline. She had sat in front of rooms full of people who underestimated her and watched their expressions change one by one like dominoes falling in slow motion. She was very, very good at waiting for the dominoes to fall. But to understand why this moment mattered as much as it did, why it hit the woman in the gray hoodie somewhere deeper than just pride, you have to go back 47 minutes earlier to when she walked through the gate alone and understand exactly who she was before any of this happened, because the story of Seat 1A didn't start on this airplane. It started a long time before that, and it was always going to end exactly like this. JFK Terminal 8 was running on its last nerve. It was 10:42 p.m. on a Thursday in November, and the rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows had been relentless since sundown. Not the gentle kind that softens a city, but the hard-driving kind that turns taxi lines into arguments and blurs the runway lights into smears of orange and gray. Stratos International Airways Flight SY-114 bound for London Heathrow had already been pushed back 20 minutes for a weather hold, and the departure board still showed delayed in amber letters that nobody was happy about. Inside the gate area, the mood was the particular brand of tense that only delayed international flights produce. Too tired to be angry, too wired to sleep, everyone quietly calculating what they were going to miss on the other end. The Stratos first-class lounge, separated from the main terminal by frosted glass, and a subtle but unmistakable barrier of wealth was quieter. 8 passengers had been assigned to the forward cabin. Most of them were already settled in the lounge, nursing drinks and speaking in the clipped tones of people accustomed to being heard. Naomi Cole was not in the lounge. She was sitting at a regular gate chair near the window, laptop open on her knees, a coffee going cold on the seat beside her. She was 42 years old, and she carried her age the way some women carry confidence. Not as an ornament, but as a fact. Her hair was natural, pulled back loosely. No jewelry except small gold studs. The hoodie she wore was the same one she'd had on since the red-eye from San Francisco 48 hours ago. She had been meaning to change. There hadn't been time. The week had been the kind that compressed entire months into a few days. Monday had been a contract negotiation in Silicon Valley. 11 hours, no breaks, a deal that would expand VaxNav's integration into the Pacific carrier network by 30%. Tuesday had been a board call at 5 a.m. because one of her European partners was in a different time zone and couldn't be bothered to adjust. Wednesday had been a keynote she'd agreed to 6 months ago and nearly canceled twice. Thursday, today, had been supposed to be a travel day, a rest. Just the flight to London for the final phase of a logistics merger that her team had been building toward for 8 months. Her assistant Dara had upgraded her ticket without asking. The text had come through at 6 p.m. You've been in 2A for 22 flights. I bumped you to 1A. Don't argue. Just sleep. Naomi had looked at the text, smiled once, and put her phone in her bag. She hadn't thought much about it after that. It was a seat. She would sleep in it for 8 hours and wake up in London. That was the plan. She was closing her laptop when she first saw Derek Hollis. He was standing at the priority boarding queue, not waiting exactly, but occupying the space in the way that certain men occupy spaces, as if the room had been arranged around his needs. He was in his early 50s, built like someone who had played rugby in college and hadn't entirely let go of it, wearing a Brioni suit that fit like a second skin and a Patek Philippe watch that caught the terminal light with each movement of his wrist. He was talking to a gate agent with the tone of a man who considers service staff an extension of his personal staff. The conversation, from what Naomi could hear as she gathered her things, was about seat assignments. He had expected an automatic upgrade. The system hadn't processed it. He wanted to know why. The gate agent was apologizing with the practiced patience of someone who apologizes for a living. Hollis wasn't interested in apologies. He wanted the upgrade. The gate agent typed something, shook her head, typed something else. Hollis exhaled through his nose, a sound that managed to convey without any actual words that he found the entire situation beneath him. Naomi picked up her bag and walked to the boarding queue. She didn't look at him again. Inside the jet bridge, the aircraft waited. The Stratos first-class cabin was the kind of space designed to make you forget briefly that you were inside a machine moving through the air at 600 miles per hour. 8 lie-flat pods arranged in a 1-2-1 configuration. Italian leather in deep charcoal. Warm gold lighting that came from somewhere subtle and even. Fresh flowers. White orchids in small geometric vases on each console. Pre-poured champagne in crystal flutes already placed at each seat. It was quiet in the way that expensive things tend to be quiet. Sophia Navarro was already in C2C laptop, open, a pair of headphones looped around her neck. She was 31 years old, with dark curly hair cut short and the particular attentiveness in her eyes that came from years of professional observation. She wrote travel and culture journalism for a mid-size outlet that punched above its weight, and she had a live stream following of around 3,400 people who had come for travel content and stayed for the way she noticed things. Her phone was sitting face up on her console, not recording yet. She had a rule about filming strangers without cause. The rule was not absolute. She had already noticed Naomi walking in. She had also noticed that seat 1A was occupied. Marco Reyes was standing at the forward galley arranging a tray with the careful precision of someone who takes quiet pride in doing his job well. He was 28, with a broad, honest face and the kind of dark eyes that registered everything without broadcasting it. He had been with Stratus for 4 years. had worked his way up from domestic routes to transatlantic, and had a reputation among the flight crew as someone who followed the rule book, not because he was afraid of consequences, but because he actually believed the rules were there for a reason. He had seen Naomi's name on the manifest during boarding prep. When she walked in, he glanced up, recognized the name with a slight stillness in his expression, and then looked back down at the tray. He hadn't said anything yet. He was still deciding whether he needed to. In seat 3, a James Whitfield was reading a physical newspaper, the International Herald Tribune, with the deliberate calm of a man who has decided that the world moves fast enough, and newspapers are one of his remaining concessions to slowness. He was 68, white-haired, with the weathered face of someone who had spent decades in rooms where serious things were decided. He had made a significant amount of money in industrial logistics, had given a significant portion of it away, and had reached the age where he was less interested in what people thought of him and more interested in what was actually happening. He had also noticed seat 1A. He turned a page, said nothing, but the newspaper came down a fraction of an inch. In seat 4, Amaya Torres sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her boarding pass creased from being held too hard. She was 17 years old, and this was the first time she had ever flown internationally. The first time she had ever sat in a first-class cabin, and quite possibly the first time she had been in any room where this many expensive things existed simultaneously. She was wearing a neat blue sweater and dark jeans. Her sneakers were clean, but old. She had spent 20 minutes in the airport bathroom before boarding, making sure she looked like she was supposed to be here. She wasn't entirely sure she was. She watched the woman in the gray hoodie walk into the cabin and felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Not much, but something. Naomi walked toward seat 1A. She stopped. Derek Hollis was already settled in shoes, off champagne in hand, tablet propped on the console. He hadn't looked up when she walked in. He was scrolling through something that appeared to be market futures, his thumb moving with the rhythmic confidence of a man who is accustomed to numbers moving in his direction. Naomi stood at the seat for a moment. She looked at the pod, the flat surface, the folded blanket, the small card with her name printed on it that the crew had placed there during setup, and that Hollis had pushed to one side without apparently registering what it said. She looked at the man occupying it. She took a breath. Summoned something she had been summoning her whole life. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "I think you might be in my seat." Derek Hollis did not look up. His thumb continued its scroll. The champagne glass rotated once in his fingers, a small automatic movement. The cabin ambient sound, soft jazz from somewhere in the overhead system, the muffled boarding announcements from the gate, the low hum of ground power, continued without interruption. He might not have heard her. He might have heard her perfectly. "Excuse me, sir," Naomi said a little louder this time. The thumb stopped. Hollis let out a breath, long calibrated the breath of a man performing inconvenience for an audience of one. He lowered the tablet with the slow deliberateness of someone demonstrating patience they don't actually feel. He looked at her. The look lasted about 2 seconds. It traveled from her sneakers, noting the wear on the right toe, up to her jeans, her hoodie, her messenger bag, her face. It wasn't a hostile look exactly. It was something cooler and in some ways worse. It was the look of a man performing a rapid and entirely confident assessment and arriving at a conclusion he considered obvious. "The economy cabin is that way," he said, pointing a manicured finger over her shoulder toward the back of the plane. His voice was the voice of a man accustomed to being understood the first time. "You're blocking the aisle." "I'm aware of where economy is," Naomi said. Her voice was steady. "You're sitting in my seat." Hollis let out a short, breathy laugh. Not a real laugh, but the sound you make when someone has said something so improbable that amusement is the only appropriate response. He picked up his champagne and took a measured sip. "This is seat 1A, he said, as if explaining a fundamental fact to someone experiencing difficulty. "This is first class." "I think you're confused, sweetheart. Check your ticket again. It probably says 10A or 21A, something like that. Go find it before you hold up departure." Naomi held up her phone. The digital boarding pass was clear on the screen. SI114, Seat 1A. Naomi Cole full fare VIP flag. It's not a mistake, she said. Hollis didn't look at the screen. He waved one hand in a dismissive arc, a gesture so practiced it had become unconscious, the wave of a man who has been waving away inconveniences for decades. Look, he said, leaning back in the pod with the ease of a man settling into something he already owns. I don't know how you got past the gate agent with that, but I'm a Diamond Elite member with Stratos. I've been one for 11 years. I fly this route 6 times a year. I requested an upgrade at the desk 30 minutes ago. Clearly, the system gave it to me. He glanced at her one more time, brief dismissive. Possession is 9/10 of the law. Now go find a flight attendant and ask for a middle seat somewhere. I'm sure they'll sort you out. He raised his tablet again. The disrespect was physical. It had weight and temperature. It wasn't just about the seat. That was the surface of it, the visible edge. What lay beneath it was the absolute certainty that she didn't belong here, delivered not with anger, but with something more corrosive, the complete absence of doubt. He hadn't even considered the possibility that he might be wrong. Naomi didn't raise her voice. She looked at him for a moment with the particular clarity of someone who has stopped being surprised but hasn't stopped noticing. "Sir," she said, her tone dropping an octave. The warmth was gone, but not replaced by anger, replaced by something quieter and more deliberate. "I paid full fare for this seat. I need you to move, and I need you to find somewhere else to stand." Hollis snapped. "I have a meeting in London tomorrow morning. The deal on the table is worth more than this aircraft. My time has a value that I promise you cannot match. I am not moving." He turned back to his screen. "This conversation is over." Naomi looked at him for a moment longer. Then she looked around the cabin. Sophia Navarro in 2C had looked up from her laptop. She wasn't filming yet. Her phone was on the console face up, her right hand resting near it with the casual proximity of someone who has made a quiet decision. Marco Reyes stood at the galley entrance, his back angled away but his shoulders rigid. He was listening. James Whitfield in 3A had lowered his newspaper to exactly the level where he could see over the top without appearing to be watching. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp. Maya Torres in 4A was staring with the wide, still eyes of someone watching something they recognize but can't yet name, a familiar shape appearing in an unfamiliar place. She had seen this look before. Not this specific man, not this specific seat, not this specific champagne glass being used as a prop in a performance of ownership, but this look, this certainty, this particular brand of being made invisible. She had seen it at 17. She had seen it at 26. She had seen it at 33. It never changed, only the setting did. "All right," she said quietly. No edge in her voice, no surrender either. "I'll find someone." She turned and walked back toward the galley. Not hurrying, not slumping, walking the way she always walked, with a directness that had taken years to develop, and no amount of dismissal had ever quite managed to erode. In her hand, her fingers were already closing around the strap of her messenger bag, feeling for the pocket where she kept the second phone. Not the regular phone, the other one. The one with no brand marking, no decorative case, no saved numbers except one. She didn't take it out yet. She wasn't ready yet. There were steps before that. There were the steps you took because they were right and fair and because they documented exactly what had been tried and exactly what had been refused. Because when the moment came, and it was going to come, she wanted there to be no question anywhere about the sequence of events. She wanted it to be clear. She had given him the chance to fix this. She had been polite. She had been direct. She had shown the ticket. Behind her, she heard Derek Hollis say something to the passenger across the aisle, something low and briefly amused, the verbal equivalent of brushing crumbs off a sleeve. Naomi's jaw set. She had also been setting the clock. Marco Reyes was stepping out of the galley with a tray when Naomi reached him. He had already started to turn toward her. Not because he had been watching, he would tell himself later, but because some part of him had known this was coming from the moment he had seen the name on the manifest. He opened his mouth to speak first. He didn't get the chance. Carol Sims appeared from the forward galley section with the velocity of a woman who has been listening for precisely this moment. She was 47 years old with blonde hair pulled into a regulation bun, a Stratus uniform that never had wrinkles, and the bearing of someone who has been the senior attendant on enough transatlantic routes to regard disruptions as personal affronts. She moved with purpose. She placed herself between Naomi and the aisle in a way that could have been accidental if you weren't paying attention. It was not accidental. "Can I help you?" she said, smiling the kind of smile that is structurally indistinguishable from warmth. "Yes," Naomi said. "There's a gentleman in seat 1A. He's not assigned to that seat. His boarding pass says 3B. I need you to ask him to move." Carol's smile held its shape while something shifted behind her eyes. A small, rapid recalculation. "I see," she said. "And you are?" "Naomi Cole. Seat 1A. Full fare." She held up the boarding pass. "Would you like to check the manifest?" "Of course," Carol said in a tone that suggested she was doing Naomi an enormous favor. She moved to the galley panel, picked up the tablet, and typed with efficient, sharp movements. From 2C, Sophia Navarro had rotated slightly in her seat. Her phone was now resting on the armrest rather than the console. The shift was less than 4 inches. It was significant. The tablet screen loaded. Naomi saw from where she stood the flash of her own name appearing on the manifest. Cole Naomi, Seat 1, A, Full Fare, V, IP flag. Before Carol's expression did the thing it was going to do. It tightened, just slightly. Carol looked at the screen, looked at Naomi, looked towards Seat 1. Where Derek Hollis was now watching the galley exchange with the relaxed interest of a man watching someone else handle a problem on his behalf. 1 second passed, 2 seconds. Carol turned off the tablet screen. "The system does show your name," she said, her voice dropping to something quieter, more confidential. "However, Mr. Hollis is a Diamond Elite member. He's been flying with Stratus for 11 years. He spends over $80,000 annually with this airline. I'm not in a position to create a confrontation with a passenger of his standing based on a booking conflict." The word conflict did a lot of work in that sentence, stretching itself to cover something it wasn't shaped to cover. "You just told me," Naomi said slowly, "that the system confirms my seat. And you're still choosing not to act on it." Carol adjusted the cuff of her sleeve. "What I can offer you," she said, "is Seat 2A. It's an excellent pod. Some passengers actually prefer it for the window angle. You want to move me from the seat I paid $14,000 for so that a man who doesn't have a ticket to it can stay comfortable. I want to resolve this efficiently so we can push back on time. What you want," Naomi said quietly, "is for me to walk away and let it go. And you're hoping I will because you've decided based on looking at me for 30 seconds that I'm the kind of person who does." Carol's smile finally dropped. Not far. Just enough to show what was underneath it. Marco Reyes stepped forward. He had been standing 2 feet away holding the tray, and his voice when it came was quiet but absolutely clear. "Ms. Sims, the manifest confirms Seat 1. A belongs to Ms. Cole. Protocol 4. B specifies that seat assignment disputes are resolved by verified manifest name, not by loyalty tier. I can pull the printed copy if you need it." He held her gaze. "It's in the forward document pouch." Carol turned to him. The look she gave him was the look of someone who has had authority long enough to regard being questioned as a form of insubordination. "Marco," she said, "this is not your call. Please go check on the economy boarding. I'm assigned to first class tonight, Ms. Sims. Then find something to do in first class that isn't this." Marco didn't move. He stood there with the steady stillness of a man who has made the decision and is no longer negotiating with it. "I think we should follow protocol," he said. From Seat 1, Derek Hollis was no longer watching with relaxed interest. He had turned more fully in his pod, one elbow on the armrest, studying the galley exchange with the narrowed attention of a man reassessing a situation. "Is there a problem up here?" he called out. His voice carried easily through the cabin. "Because if there's a question about the seating, I think it's pretty straightforward. I'm sitting here. The system gave me the upgrade. I don't know why we're still discussing it." Carol glanced back at him, then at Naomi, then at Marco. And then she said in a voice she pitched for Marco alone, but that carried nonetheless Marco, "Look at the situation. Look at her. And look at him. Use some judgment." The galley went quiet. Sophia Navarro's finger pressed record. Naomi had heard it. Marco had heard it. From 2C, Sophia had heard it. 3 seconds of silence spread through the forward section like water finding its level. When Naomi spoke again, her voice had not risen. If anything, it had lowered, becoming more precise the way certain instruments get quieter as they become more accurate. "Look at her, and look at him," she said. "That's what this is, Carol. That's what it's always been." Carol's face went through several rapid expressions, none of them comfortable. "That is not what I meant. You had the information on that screen," Naomi said. "You had the authority to act on it. You made a choice. And you told me in 8 words exactly what that choice was based on." She paused. "I'm going to give you one more chance to do your job correctly. If you don't, I will handle this myself. And I promise you, what happens next will be something you remember for the rest of your career." Carol straightened her spine. When she found her voice, it had recovered some of its professional casing. "Is that a threat?" "No," Naomi said. "It's a forecast." From seat 3, a James Whitfield had folded his newspaper completely in half and placed it on his console. He was not pretending to read anymore. Hollis stood up from his pod, not to leave, but to make himself taller to fill the space, to reshape the physical geography of the situation in his favor. He was considerably taller than Naomi. He seemed to be aware of this. "Look," he said, his voice taking on the deliberate cadence of a man who has decided to be reasonable. "I understand you're frustrated. These system errors happen. But here's the reality. I have a $200 million deal closing in London tomorrow morning. I have been a loyal Diamond Elite customer for over a decade. I have brought significant business to this airline." He spread his hands in a gesture of magnanimous logic. "That has to count for something. So let's be adults about this. You take 2A, which is a perfectly fine seat. We all move on, and everyone arrives in London having had a decent night's sleep." Naomi looked at him. She looked at him the way you look at something you want to remember accurately. "What seat is printed on your boarding pass, Mr. Hollis?" she asked. His expression flickered. "That's not the relevant question. It's the only relevant question in this conversation." "What?" "Seat from 2C. Sophia said quietly enough that it could be conversation. "That's a good question." Hollis looked at Sophia, saw the phone, looked back at Naomi. Something moved through his eyes, a brief recalculation. But it didn't reach the conclusion it should have reached. It reached a different conclusion. The conclusion of a man who has operated without consequence long enough to believe he is operating in a consequence-free zone. "I'm not going to stand here and be interrogated by a passenger who doesn't belong." "Doesn't belong," Naomi said very quietly. The 2 words landed like stones dropped into still water. "I paid full fare for this seat, Mr. Hollis. I have the boarding pass. The manifest confirms my name. Your flight attendant saw it herself, and you have just told me twice that I don't belong." She let that sit for exactly 1 beat. "I want you to think very carefully about the next thing you say." Hollis looked around the cabin. James Whitfield was watching him openly now. Maya in 4A was watching with her hands still folded, her eyes steady. Marco stood at the galley entrance. Sophia's phone was recording. He found no allies, but he also found no consequences yet. Just watching faces. Just a woman in a gray hoodie who still hadn't raised her voice. He sat back down. "Before we go any further, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you've ever been underestimated because of how you looked, if you've ever been told in words or without them that you don't belong somewhere you've earned the right to be, hit that subscribe button. Because Naomi Cole is just getting started. And so is this story." Naomi walked to seat 2A. She did not sit in it the way someone sits in a seat they have accepted. She sat in it the way you sit when you need both hands free and a clear line of sight and approximately 3 minutes of uninterrupted thought. She placed her messenger bag on her knees. She did not lean back. She did not take the champagne. From here, she could see everything. Seat 1A, where Derek Hollis had resumed his tablet scrolling with the studied composure of a man determined to perform indifference. Seat 3. A, where James Whitfield sat with his folded newspaper and his watchful eyes. Seat 2. C, where Sophia Navarro had her phone tilted at a casual angle that was not casual at all. Seat 4. A, where Maya Torres sat with her boarding pass now smoothed carefully flat on the console in front of her, as if she needed to be able to verify at any moment that she had indeed been assigned to this cabin. And the galley where Carol Sims and Marco Reyes were having a conversation in low voices that Naomi could hear fragments of over the ambient hum of the boarding still underway in economy. She heard just needs to accept the situation. She heard manifest is clear, Ms. Sims' protocol says. She heard not asking what protocol says I'm asking you to. She heard the silence that followed that unfinished sentence. Then she heard Carol's footsteps on the carpet coming toward her. Carol appeared at the edge of seat 2A and crouched slightly, dropping her voice to the confidential register she had deployed earlier. Her expression was a careful composition, concern at the edge's firmness at the center. Miss Cole, I want to help you resolve this comfortably. Naomi looked at her. I know this is frustrating, Carol continued, pressing forward into the silence. Seat conflicts are genuinely difficult situations. The system upgrade protocols are not always transparent to passengers, and Mr. Hollis clearly believed his upgrade request had been processed. What I'd like to do, Naomi said. Stop! Carol stopped. I'm not asking you to help me feel comfortable. I'm asking you to do your job. Your job tonight is to ensure that the passengers of this flight are seated in the seats their tickets assign them to. My ticket assigns me to seat 1A. The manifest confirms it. You saw it yourself. Naomi kept her voice even and measured. What I need from you is very simple. Walk to seat 1. A. Tell Mr. Hollis that the passenger assigned to that seat requires it and ask him to move to his assigned seat, which is 3B. I understand that. That's all. That's the whole thing. It's not complicated. It's not confrontational unless he makes it confrontational. It's just your job. Carol's expression shifted. The concern drained away from the edges and left only the firmness. What is complicated, Carol said, her voice taking on a new and quieter edge, is that I have been the senior attendant on transatlantic routes for 9 years. I have managed thousands of boarding situations. I have a sense of what creates problems and what resolves them. And I am telling you professionally that the most efficient resolution to this situation is for me to give up my seat, is for us to avoid a cabin incident that makes everyone's flight worse. I see, Naomi said. And everyone in that sentence doesn't include me. Carol stood up slightly straighter. Marco appeared at the galley entrance. He was holding a printed sheet. The paper manifest pulled from the forward document pouch exactly as he had said he would. He held it with the careful grip of someone who has decided that paper is harder to dismiss than a tablet screen. Ms. Sims, he said, printed manifest. Seat 1, a Cole Naomi. Full fare. VIP designation. Checked in at JFK main terminal at 9:17 p.m. He looked up. There's no ambiguity in the record. Carol looked at the paper, then at Marco. Her voice dropped to something that was trying to be private. Marco, I'm asking you as your senior crew member to let me handle this situation. I'm not challenging your authority, Ms. Sims. I'm providing documentation you asked for. I didn't ask for it. I know, I pulled it anyway. He held the paper steady. Because it matters. There was a pause that lasted about 4 seconds and contained in its compression the entire weight of every time a junior employee has held a piece of paper against a senior employee's preference and waited to see what happened next. Carol took the manifest, looked at it, set it down on the galley counter without folding it. I'll speak to Mr. Hollis, she said, and her tone made clear that this was a concession, not a correction. She walked to seat 1A with the measured pace of someone who has already decided how this conversation is going to end. Naomi watched. Carol leaned toward Hollis, said something quietly. Hollis looked up. A brief exchange followed. Naomi couldn't hear every word, but she heard the register of it. Hollis's voice going through the same performance it had gone through before, the reasonable tone, the logical argument, the implicit suggestion that Carol was being asked to manage an unreasonable passenger rather than redirect an unreasonable one. She saw Carol nod once, a nod that was not agreement so much as acknowledgement. She saw Carol straighten up. She saw Carol walk back toward the galley. She knew before Carol spoke what the answer was going to be. I spoke with Mr. Hollis, Carol said, crouching again near seat 2. A. He maintains that the gate agent verbally confirmed an upgrade was being processed. He believes he is sitting in good faith, given the ambiguity of the situation. There is no ambiguity, Marco said from the galley entrance. He hadn't moved. Carol turned to him. The look she gave him this time was not a look of professional correction. It was a look of someone who had decided that Marco's continued presence in this conversation was a problem that would be addressed later, and was choosing to table that problem rather than engage with it now. She turned back to Naomi. Given the situation, she said again, as if Marco hadn't spoken, I am prepared to offer you 2A as your confirmed seat for this flight with a full fare adjustment and a complimentary upgrade voucher for your next Stratos booking. Naomi was quiet for a moment. You're offering me a voucher, she said. As a gesture of, you're offering me a piece of paper that says sorry for a situation that isn't ambiguous, documented in a manifest that your airline printed and I didn't, involving a seat I paid $14,000 for. And the resolution you're proposing is that I take the seat next to it and feel good about a voucher. Carol said nothing. What I find interesting, Naomi said, and her voice had gone very calm now, very precise, is that you pulled up the manifest on that tablet and you saw my name and you turned the screen off. You had the information, you had the authority, and you turned the screen off. She looked at Carol directly. I want you to understand something. I have sat in rooms like this my whole life, not always airplanes. Sometimes boardrooms, sometimes conference stages, sometimes lobbies. But the room is always the same, and the choice is always the same. The person in authority sees the information, and then they decide whether to act on it or whether to act on something else, something less official, something they can't quite write down in the incident report. You made that choice tonight, Carol. I saw you make it. Carol's face had gone through several stages during this and had arrived at something that wasn't quite hostility and wasn't quite shame. It was the expression of a person who is being described accurately and finding the experience extremely unpleasant. I'm going to try one more time, Naomi said. Ask him to move. Carol stood up fully. When she spoke, her voice had recovered its professional shell, but it was thinner than before. My recommendation stands 2A with the upgrade voucher. If you're not comfortable with that, I can review standby options. Standby. There may be options on the morning flight. Naomi looked at her for a long moment. Thank you, Carol, she said, for making the situation very clear. She reached into her messenger bag. Her hand closed around the second phone. No brand marking. No case matte black lighter than it looked. She held it in her lap without opening it yet. In seat 3, a James Whitfield folded his newspaper one more time, creasing it sharply, and set it on the console, as if setting down something he no longer needed. In seat 2C, Sophia's live stream was quiet but running. The viewer count was 1,200. Marco stood at the galley entrance and did not leave his post. Naomi looked down at the phone in her hand. One contact. No name. Just a number she had committed to memory on the day she first understood what the company she was building might eventually become. She looked up once more at seat 1A, where Derek Hollis was sipping champagne and reviewing market futures with the serenity of a man who believes the story has already been settled. She thought, not yet. She thought, but soon. The rain against the terminal windows made the same sound it had made against a different window in a different city 25 years ago. Naomi was looking at the rain when the memory came back. Not asked for, just present, the way certain memories are present, arriving when the conditions are right. She was 17 years old. She had just been accepted to a summer STEM intensive at Georgia Tech, one of 12 students selected from across the country, the only one from her school, the only one who had used her lunch breaks to finish the application because she didn't have a computer at home. The program came with a full scholarship that covered housing in the campus dormitory. She took a Greyhound bus from Atlanta's South Side. She had one bag. She wore her good hoodie, forest green, the one without the fraying cuffs. The dormitory housing office was on the 3rd floor of a brick building that smelled like floor wax and old paper. The woman at the check-in desk was in her late 50s, with reading glasses on a chain and a cardigan that said in its details that she had been sitting at that desk for many years and expected to continue doing so. She looked up when Naomi pushed open the door. Her expression performed a rapid and entirely unconscious assessment. The same assessment Naomi would see performed in different forms in different rooms for the next 25 years. The result of the assessment played on the woman's face in the fraction of a second before she rearranged it. "The cleaning staff entrance is around the back, honey." Naomi stood in the doorway. She had in her hand the confirmation letter from Georgia Tech's STEM office. The letter had her full name at the top in bold letters. It had the date of the program, the dormitory assignment, the name of the faculty supervisor. She walked to the desk and placed the letter down without saying anything. The woman picked it up, read it. A pause followed, not long but long enough to contain something. When she reached for the room key, she didn't apologize. She didn't acknowledge what she had said. She simply handed over the key and looked back down at whatever she had been looking at before. Naomi took the key. She climbed 4 flights of stairs to her room. The elevator was broken, and sat down on the edge of a narrow dormitory bed with a plastic-covered mattress and a view of a parking lot. She sat there for a while in the particular silence that settles after certain moments. She did not cry. She was 17, and she had learned without being explicitly taught that certain reactions cost you in rooms that were already calculating the odds against you. She opened her notebook instead. On the first page, she wrote one sentence: "I will build something they cannot ignore." She had filled 3 notebooks since then. The sentence was on the first page of every single one. The 4th notebook was in her messenger bag right now. Naomi came back to the present. The dim gold light of the cabin, the rain against the oval window, the second phone in her hand. She looked at it for a moment. Then she opened the contact. 1 number. Memorized, not saved. For emergencies only, or for moments that were not emergencies in the traditional sense, but were something else. Moments where the thing that had been building for a very long time had finally arrived at the place where it was supposed to land. She pressed call. Derek Hollis had made a decision somewhere in the last 5 minutes. The decision was this: the situation was over. The flight attendant had spoken to the woman in the hoodie. The woman in the hoodie had gone back to 2A. The plane would push back shortly. He would have his champagne refilled and his noise-canceling headphones on before the cabin door sealed, and by the time they were over the Atlantic, this would be nothing but an anecdote. Something to tell at dinner in London, the story about the confused passenger who thought she could muscle her way into first class by waving a phone at people. He felt good about the resolution. This was the particular confidence of a man who has never had to sit with the consequences of a story for long enough to discover he was the wrong kind of protagonist. He gestured Marco over. Marco came because Marco was a professional and because choosing his battles carefully was part of how he survived in rooms that weren't arranged in his favor. "Another glass," Hollis said, not looking at him. "And tell me, are we close to pushing back? This delay is absurd." Marco poured without comment. Hollis looked across the aisle at the passenger in seat 1B, a man in his 40s in a gray blazer who had been invisible for the entire boarding process the way business travelers learn to be invisible. "You know what the real problem with first class these days?" Hollis said conversationally. Not to Marco. To the cabin in general, to the air, to anyone in earshot who might find it agreeable. They give these seats away. Loyalty upgrades. Booking glitches, error adjustments. You work for 11 years to build your status, and then the system auto-populates the premium cabin with whoever happened to click the right button. He shook his head. Next thing you know, everyone thinks they belong here. He didn't look at seat 2A when he said it. He didn't need to. The geometry of the cabin was small enough that the sentence found its way there on its own. From seat 3, a James Whitfield looked up. He was a man who had spent 4 decades in rooms where language was used with precision as a weapon, and learned to recognize the technique even when it was being deployed clumsily. "I don't think the lady was upgraded," he said, his voice the even-measured voice of someone who is not angry yet, but has decided to engage. "I saw her boarding pass. It said 1A. Hollis looked at him with mild surprise. The surprise of a man who is not accustomed to being contradicted by strangers in first class and is recalibrating rapidly. "I said she's confused." Hollis said, the pleasant tone he was using doing imperfect work of concealing its own edges. "Not everything that's printed is accurate, friend. These things happen." The manifest confirmed her name, Marco said from the galley. He hadn't been invited into the conversation. He entered it anyway. Hollis looked at him. The look was brief and thorough. "The manifest also told me my upgrade was confirmed," Hollis said. "So the manifest and I have a complicated relationship tonight," from seat 2C. Sophia said without looking up from her phone. "Mr. Hollis, what seat is printed on your boarding pass?" The question landed in the cabin and stayed there occupying the air. Hollis turned to look at Sophia. He saw the phone. He clocked it. The angle, the live indicator, the small but unmistakable fact that this woman had been recording him for an unspecified amount of time. His jaw shifted. "That he said is none of your business." "It kind of is," Sophia said pleasantly. "Given that you're currently sitting in someone else's, James Whitfield said I believe the answer is 3B. I saw that as well." The cabin had gone quiet in the way that small spaces go quiet when enough people in them have decided to pay attention to the same thing. Economy boarding continued behind the curtain, muffled and oblivious. In here, 4 pairs of eyes were aimed at Derek Hollis with varying degrees of expectation. He found no one to agree with him. He found no allies, no sympathetic faces, no helpful reinforcement of his position. He found watching faces. He found a 17-year-old girl in seat 4A who was holding her boarding pass too tight and looking at him with something in her expression that he would, if he were paying closer attention, recognize as recognition. He was not paying that kind of attention. He stood up, not to leave the seat, to occupy more of the space, to fill the conversation with his height and his suit and the implicit argument of his physical confidence. "I have been flying this route for 12 years, he said. His voice had climbed slightly, not to shouting, but to the volume of a man who is accustomed to rooms adjusting to his volume, rather than the other way around. "I know the crew on this route. I know this airline. And I know that when there is a genuine question about who belongs in a premium seat, when it comes down to documented history and verified loyalty versus a ticket that may or may not have been correctly issued, the answer is generally the person who has earned the right to be here." He paused. Not the person who wandered in, dressed for a gym session. No one in the cabin agreed with him out loud. No one disagreed out loud either. The silence was different from earlier silences. Earlier silences had been the silence of people watching and staying out of it. This silence was the silence of people who had heard something and were deciding what to do with it. Maya Torres, in seat 4A, pressed her lips together. Her eyes were bright. In seat 2, Naomi had not moved. She had not looked at Hollis. She was looking at the phone in her hand, her thumb resting against the screen, and her expression was the expression of someone who has heard something clarifying. "Not surprising, just clarifying. That's all I needed," she said quietly, to herself. She looked up once, at James Whitfield, who was watching her with a look that she read correctly as both witnessing and something close to apology. At Sophia, whose phone had caught every word and whose expression beneath its professional neutrality was controlled fury. At Marco, standing at the galley entrance with his shoulders rigid and his eyes holding hers for a brief direct moment. Then she looked down at the contact on her phone. "Dara," she said when it connected. Her voice was completely, unperformatively calm. "I need you to check the VX-NAV license status for Stratus International Airways." In seat 1, Derek Hollis sat back down. He considered the conversation resolved. He picked up his champagne. He did not know that the clock he'd been trying to stop had in fact just started running. Marco Reyes walked out of the galley. Not to serve, not to check on a passenger. He walked out because he had reached the end of a very specific internal conversation. The conversation a person has with themselves about the cost of staying silent versus the cost of speaking and the permanent nature of whichever side they choose. He had been having that conversation since the moment Naomi Cole's name had appeared on the manifest, and he had seen the seating configuration and understood what was likely coming. He walked to the center of the first-class aisle and stood there, and his voice when he spoke was the voice of someone who has made the decision and is no longer negotiating with it. "Mr. Hollis, I need to ask you directly. What seat is printed on your boarding pass?" Derek Hollis looked at Marco Reyes the way certain men look at people who work in service positions when those people forget from the man's perspective the appropriate shape of the interaction. It was not quite contempt. It was something more architectural than that, a sense that Marco had arranged himself incorrectly in the space. Son Hollis said, his voice going to a slow and careful register, "You should think carefully about whose side you pick here. I've had conversations with your airline's senior management about service excellence on this route. I know how these things go." Marco held his position. "I'm not picking sides, Mr. Hollis. I'm following protocol. What seat does your boarding pass say?" Hollis looked at him for another 3 seconds. Then, with the deliberateness of a man who intends the action itself to be an argument, he reached into his jacket and pulled out his boarding pass. He didn't hand it to Marco. He dropped it onto the console beside his champagne, as if placing evidence. The printed seat number was facing up. 3B. The cabin read it simultaneously. James Whitfield read it. Sophia read it. Maya read it. Marco read it. Naomi from seat 2A read it. The number sat in the cabin air and did not require any commentary. James Whitfield set down his drink. 3B, he said. His voice was quiet and certain. "That's what I thought." Hollis opened his mouth. "The gate agent. Did they confirm it in writing?" James asked. "These things are verbally." "Sir?" James leaned forward slightly. "The seat printed on your ticket says 3B. The seat you're sitting in belongs to this woman. That is not a system error. That is not an ambiguity. That is a straightforward situation, and you know it." Hollis looked at James with an expression that was trying to be dismissive and achieving something closer to cornered. Marco turned to Naomi. "Ms. Cole Marco said the printed manifest and the digital record both confirm that seat 1A is yours. I apologize for the time it took me to say that clearly." He held her gaze. "I should have said it sooner." From the galley, Carol's voice came sharp and close. "Marco, stand down." Marco turned to look at her. "Ms. Sims, I'm following printed protocol. If you want to override that, I'll need the override documented and signed." The request was professional, quiet, and completely unanswerable. It was not a challenge. It was a procedure. Carol knew the procedure as well as Marco did. She knew there was no such documented override. She knew that asking her for one in front of a cabin full of passengers who were now all paying attention was the equivalent of being asked to hand someone a rope they didn't have. Carol said nothing. From 2C. Sophia adjusted the angle of her phone by approximately 3 degrees and spoke in the tone of a journalist doing what she was trained to do, describing accurately what was in front of her. "For those joining the stream, we are on Stratos International S1114 at JFK boarding for London Heathrow. A woman with a confirmed full-fare first-class booking to seat 1A has been sitting in 2A for the past 23 minutes, while the man whose boarding pass says seat 3B continues to occupy 1A. The flight attendant who confirmed the booking error is named Carol. The flight attendant who is following documented protocol correctly is named Marco." She kept her voice completely neutral. She was not editorializing. She did not need to. "Viewer count 200. Climbing." Hollis turned towards Sophia fully for the first time. His face had gone through its remaining performance options and arrived at one that was less polished than the others. A face that wanted to be angry but was doing the math on what angry would cost him in front of a live audience that was currently at 200 people and increasing. "You have no right to broadcast. We are on a commercial aircraft with no expectation of total privacy," Sophia said pleasantly. "And everything I am describing is accurate. If you'd like to dispute the accuracy, please go ahead." Hollis looked around the cabin. James Whitfield met his eyes without expression. Maya in 4A met his eyes without flinching. Something had shifted in her in the last few minutes. She was still young, still nervous, still holding her boarding pass too tightly. But the look she was giving Hollis was not the look of someone trying to become invisible. It was the look of someone who has decided to see exactly what is happening and remember it. Marco stood at the end of the aisle and said nothing more. He had said what he needed to say. And in seat 2, a Naomi had Dara on the phone and the conversation was almost over. Level 4. Dara's voice came through the earpiece. Precise and calm, requires VX nav to initiate a full handshake verification. During the process, all non-essential electrical systems are suspended. Entertainment climate control galley power, 8 to 14 minutes. The aircraft cannot depart during an active level 4. "Understood," Naomi said. "Authorization code." "Cole Vertex 9. Naomi looked up, found Marco's eyes. He held them steady. She gave him the smallest nod, not instruction, just acknowledgement. Recognition of what he had done tonight and what it had cost him and what it was worth. Then she found Maya's eyes. The girl in seat 4A who was watching everything with the focused, remembering gaze of someone who is very young and very certain that this moment is going to matter later. Naomi held her gaze for 1 second and said, without speaking, the thing she wished someone had said to her at 17 in a dormitory hallway. "You belong here. Stay." Then she looked down at the phone. "Dara," she said. "Cole Vertex 9. Initiate level 4. There was a fraction of a second between saying the words and pressing end. A pause so small it wasn't really a pause, just the space between one heartbeat and the next. And in that space, the memory was already there. 26 years old. Vertex Aero was 6 people in a co-working space in Atlanta with a leaky window on the west wall and a coffee machine that worked 3 days out of 5. VXNav was not yet a product. It was a proof of concept, a working prototype, and a 100-page deck that Naomi had written over 14 months while holding down a contract job to pay the rent. The meeting with Caldwell Capital was at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. She had confirmed it twice. She wore her black blazer, the good one, and she had her hair pulled back and her deck printed in color on the best paper she could justify. She was early. The lobby of Caldwell Capital was the kind of lobby that spent money communicating permanence. Marble floors, a reception desk the size of a small boat, the names of the firm's founders etched in a wall that was probably load-bearing in some metaphorical sense. The receptionist looked up when Naomi came in. "Are you here for the intern orientation?" Naomi placed her confirmation email and her printed meeting request on the desk. The receptionist looked at them, looked at Naomi, typed something. Her expression went through a brief rearrangement. "I'll let them know you're here." Naomi sat down in one of the lobby chairs and waited. She watched other people come in and get directed to meeting rooms with different energy. She watched a white man in his 30s walk to the reception desk, say his name, and be immediately accompanied upstairs by someone who had apparently been waiting for him. She waited. 40 minutes after her confirmed appointment time, a man in his late 20s came down. Not a partner, not a senior associate, but a junior analyst, the kind of person firms send when they want to take a meeting without taking it seriously. He was pleasant enough. He shook her hand. He looked at the deck. He said, "This is interesting. It's innovative. I think the tech has real potential." He paused, turning a page with the careful neutrality of someone preparing to deliver a pre-decided verdict. "I'm just not sure the market is ready for this type of product from this type of team." The phrase "this type of team" did not refer to the team's qualifications. They both knew that. Naomi thanked him, shook his hand, walked out of the building into the flat gray of a November afternoon and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the city move around her. She did not call anyone. She did not sit in her car and cry, though the impulse was there, honest and real and entirely understandable. She got in the car, opened her laptop on her knees in the parking garage, and began rewriting the pitch deck from the beginning. Sharper, harder, built for a room that was not going to give her anything it wasn't compelled to give. She found a different investor 14 months later. Then another. Then a contract with a regional carrier that became a template. Then a contract with a major carrier that changed everything. Caldwell Capital called her 3 years after that Tuesday. A different partner, different energy, extremely interested in exploring an investment relationship. She had Dara send a polite professional non-reply. She thought about that now, in the dim gold light of the Stratos first-class cabin, the second phone warm in her hand. The call to Dara already ended. She thought about the parking garage and the laptop on her knees and the certainty she had made herself feel from the outside in, because she had learned early that certainty was sometimes a thing you constructed rather than a thing you found. She had constructed it. She had carried it. She was carrying it now. The phone screen lit up with a brief confirmation from Dara initiating. T minus 90 seconds. Naomi put the phone in her lap. She looked at seat 1A. She waited. The cabin was running normally. Jazz from the overhead speakers. The low industrial hum of pre-departure ground systems. Carol at the forward end of the aisle with the clipped, deliberate movements of a woman preparing for departure and willing by the force of will alone the situation to have resolved itself. Marco in the galley, moving with the contained precision of someone who has done everything in his power and is now waiting to see what that power amounted to. Hollis in one. A champagne refilled tablet raised, performing, and it was a performance now visible as one, the ease of a man who had won. Sophia's live stream had climbed to 3,400 viewers. She wasn't narrating anymore. She had tilted the phone to capture the cabin in ambient mode, the contrast of the warm, elegant light against the tight, barely contained tension of the people inside it, and let it speak for itself. It was speaking. Naomi looked at the screen of the second phone. Dara's confirmation was there. 90 seconds. She looked at the time in the corner of the screen. She looked at the window, the rain, the tarmac lights blurring and running. She looked at seat 1A. Derek Hollis had stopped pretending to read the market futures. He was watching the galley from behind the elevated edge of his tablet, and the watching was the watching of a man who wants to verify that the situation he has decided is over is in fact staying over. It was not. Carol appeared at the head of the aisle with the brisk energy of someone about to close out a process. "We'll be closing the main cabin door in approximately 8 minutes, she announced, mainly for Naomi's benefit in the direction it was aimed. All passengers should be seated. Electronic devices should be on airplane mode once the door is sealed, Naomi said pleasantly. "I know. The door's not sealed yet." Carol stopped walking. "Miss Cole, if you're making a phone call—" "I just finished one," Naomi said. "Thank you, Carol." Carol looked at the phone in Naomi's hand. There was something in the phone's appearance. The absence of branding, the flat matte surface, the slightly unusual dimensions, that registered as unusual without Carol being able to articulate why. "What was that call?" she asked. "My office," Naomi said. "From seat 1. Hollis lowered the tablet fully. He had heard the exchange. His eyes moved between Naomi and the phone with the rapid, calibrating attention of someone beginning to suspect the landscape has changed shape while he wasn't watching. "Carol," he said, "if she's making calls that could interfere with—" "She said the call is finished," Marco said from the galley. Hollis looked at Marco with pure, unadorned dislike. "I was talking to the senior attendant." "I know," Marco said. The silence after that was approximately 2 seconds long and had the quality of a held breath. Naomi looked at her watch. 60 seconds. She looked at Sophia. Sophia gave her nothing. No acknowledgement, no signal, just the steady professional gaze of a journalist who has learned to be a camera when she needs to be. But the phone was aimed correctly. James Whitfield had set down his newspaper. He was watching Naomi with the concentrated attention of a man who has spent decades in rooms where important things happened and has learned to recognize the specific quality of silence that precedes them. Maya in 4A had her hands flat on the armrests. She looked like someone trying very hard not to look like she knew something was about to happen. She didn't know, but she felt it. 40 seconds. Carol was still standing in the aisle, her professional composure running at full load. Now the sense that something was slightly wrong in a way she couldn't map to a procedure. Note sharpening her expression into something nearly alert. "Ms. Cole," she said, and her voice had changed. The smooth service register had thinned out, revealing something more genuinely uncertain beneath it. "Who did you call?" "I told you, my office." "And what does your office?" "My office manages things Naomi said that I'm responsible for. Tonight, one of those things needed managing." 20 seconds. Hollis was fully upright now, his champagne set aside, both feet on the floor. The performance of ease was over. His face was doing the thing faces do when the brain is running fast, and the conclusion it keeps arriving at is one it doesn't want to accept. "She's doing something," he said. He wasn't talking to anyone specifically. He was narrating, which was the first sign that he had lost the thread of his own certainty. "Carol, she did something. She made a call, and she's—" 10 seconds. Naomi looked at the overhead panel. She looked at the small ambient light built into the console of seat 2A. She looked at the entertainment screen in her pod currently showing the Stratos Welcome graphic on its slow looping cycle. She looked at them the way you look at something that is about to change. She looked at Derek Hollis. He was looking back at her. For the first time since she had stepped onto this aircraft, their eyes were fully directly on each other. Not the glancing eye contact of confrontation, but the held eye contact of two people who are both in this moment exactly where the story requires them to be. Naomi said nothing. The jazz cut off mid-note. The warm, gold, ambient lighting died. What replaced it was the flat, functional white of emergency strips running along the floor of the aisle and the overhead. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just suddenly, completely, undeniably wrong. The air conditioning, which had been a constant presence, a background hum so consistent it had become invisible, stopped. The silence that followed was not just the absence of sound. It had texture. It had weight. The entertainment screens went black. The galley panel went dark. From behind the curtain in economy, the sound of the boarding process. Announcements, movement, the shuffle of 260 people finding their places, stopped. A beat of silence. Then voices rising, someone calling for a flight attendant, someone's child beginning to cry. In the first-class cabin, no one spoke. Derek Hollis was gripping the armrests of seat 1A. The champagne he had set aside was perfectly still on the console beside him. His face had gone to a color that the warm lighting would have softened, and that the emergency lighting did not. Carol's hands found the galley counter and stayed there. Marco stood in the galley entrance and kept his face completely neutral, which took effort. James Whitfield looked at the overhead panels, then at the darkened galley, then slowly at Naomi. Maya's eyes were wide. Naomi sat in seat 2A with her hands in her lap, and the second phone resting on her knee, face down, its work completed. She had not moved. She had not raised her voice. She had not produced a badge or a title or a credential. She had made one phone call to one person in an office 3 time zones behind her. And she was waiting with the patience of someone who has been waiting for things most of her life and has gotten extremely good at it for the next 45 seconds to do what the next 45 seconds were designed to do. "What the hell is going on?" Hollis said, and his voice in the dead silence of the cabin was too loud for the question and not loud enough for the fear underneath it. My screen just stopped. "Carol, the air's already—" "I know," Carol said. Her voice had shed its professional register entirely. She was just a person now, standing in a dark cabin, gripping a counter. "I know I don't." "What did you do?" Hollis had turned to Naomi. It came out more quietly than he intended, more genuinely uncertain. The question of a man who has just looked at a board and understood he is not, after all, winning. Naomi looked at him. "I called my office," she said. "They're running a compliance check." "A compliance check doesn't—" "This one does," she said. From somewhere in the cockpit, behind the sealed door, the muffled sound of an alarm began. The alarm lasted 11 seconds, then it stopped. The silence after it was heavier than the silence before. It had accumulated the weight of 300 passengers trying to understand what was happening and arriving at no comfortable answer. From behind the first-class curtain, the sounds of economy had resolved into something between confusion and the low-grade collective anxiety of people in an enclosed space who have lost power and have not been told why. Someone back there was crying. A child. The particular sound of it, small, uncertain, not yet full panic, cut through the cabin like a frequency designed specifically to reach the part of human beings that responds to children in distress. Derek Hollis sat in seat 1A and did not look like a man who had been winning anything. He was still gripping the armrests. The champagne on his console had not moved the surface of the liquid perfectly flat and still, which somehow made the absence of all other movement in the cabin more pronounced. The screen of his pod was black. He had touched the seat controls twice, the button to adjust the recline, the button to activate the massage function. Reflexive attempts to interface with something that was no longer responding. Nothing. He looked at his phone. It showed full bars, which meant the issue was not external signal. The issue was internal. The issue was the aircraft. "Carol, what happened to the air? It's already getting warmer." Carol was at the galley panel pressing buttons in the practiced sequence of someone running through emergency protocols, finding nothing that responded. Her professional composure was still technically present, but had become like a wall with visible cracks in it. The structure maintained by habit, the integrity of the structure genuinely uncertain. "I'm working on it, Mr. Hollis," she said, which was the phrase flight attendants use when they mean I don't know and I need you to sit quietly while I figure it out. She picked up the interphone handset to call the cockpit. The line was dead. She stood with the handset in her hand for 2 seconds, which is a very long time when you are a senior transatlantic flight attendant and the interphone has never in your experience been dead at the gate. James Whitfield spoke from 3A. His voice was calm, measured, and completely lacking in hysteria, which made it the most authoritative voice in the cabin. "Has anyone been on an aircraft when the full electrical bus went out at the gate?" he asked to no one specifically. "Because I have. Once. 1987 Bangkok. This is what it feels like." He paused, and that time it was a mechanical fault. The timing of this one seems different. He looked at Naomi when he said that last part. Naomi said nothing. Hollis was on his feet again, standing this time not to dominate the space, but because staying seated felt wrong because the physical act of standing created the illusion of agency in a situation that was offering him none. "She did this," he said. His voice had lost all of its controlled calibration. "She made a phone call and then this happened. Carol, I'm telling you, she did something. She called someone. She's holding the plane." "That is a serious accusation," James said. "It is a serious situation," Hollis said, turning on him. "This is 300 people on a grounded aircraft because this woman decided to—" "Because," James said with the steady patience of a man who has outlasted many louder voices, "she was sitting in a seat that belonged to her, and the people responsible for this cabin decided not to do their job. She shut down the plane. You stole her seat." The simplicity of the exchange landed in the dark cabin and stayed there. From seat 2C, Sophia was still recording, still live. Her voice when she spoke was the voice she used for the most significant moments, quieter than usual, more precise. "For the 6,000 people watching this right now, this is Flight SI-114 at JFK. The aircraft has lost all non-essential power. The flight crew appears to be unable to contact the cockpit via the cabin interphone. The woman who was denied her confirmed first-class seat made one phone call approximately 90 seconds ago. The connection between those two events is something I'll let you draw your own conclusions about." She tilted the phone slowly around the cabin. The emergency strip lighting along the floor, the dark screens, the tight faces of the other passengers, Carol at the galley with the dead interphone Hollis standing in the aisle, like a man whose entire architecture of confidence has had the structural support removed. Then she tilted it to Naomi. Naomi was sitting with her hands in her lap in the flat white emergency light, looking at nothing in particular. She looked like someone sitting in a waiting room, patient and self-contained with all the time in the world. "How are you doing that?" a voice said. It came from seat 2B. A passenger in his late 30s who had been asleep since boarding and had woken up to darkness and confusion, leaning out of his pod looking at Naomi with an expression caught between fascination and unease. "I'm not doing anything," Naomi said. "The airline systems are running a mandatory compliance verification. It happens when protocols are breached. The software that runs this aircraft is sensitive to certain kinds of override." She said it the way you explain a weather pattern, descriptively without drama, as though this were simply how things worked. From seat 1, Hollis made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "The software that runs," he started. "You expect anyone to believe that?" He turned fully to the cabin, spreading his arms wide, seeking the room he normally occupied. "She made a phone call. This is a coincidence, or it's sabotage, or it's... Does anyone here actually believe that this woman..." He gestured at her, at the hoodie, at the jeans, at the worn sneakers. He gestured at everything he had assessed and dismissed in 30 seconds in a boarding queue. And in every version of that assessment, in every room like this one for the last 42 years of Naomi Cole's life, the cabin did not respond to his appeal. From seat 4, Amaya Torres said in a voice that was barely above a whisper but carried in the silence with perfect clarity, "Are we going to be okay?" She was looking at Naomi, just Naomi, not at Carol, not at Hollis, not at the flight crew or the captain's door or any of the people and structures that were supposed to be the answer to that question in this kind of situation. She was looking at the woman in the gray hoodie who had been the calmest person in this cabin since the moment she walked in. Naomi turned to her. For the first time since she had boarded this aircraft, the controlled precision that she had been maintaining, the careful load-bearing structure of her calm, softened fractionally but genuinely into something warmer. "We're going to be fine," Naomi said. "I promise." Maya looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded once and sat back in her seat. This is the moment everything changes. If you're just finding this story, subscribe right now and drop a comment. Do you think Naomi went too far, or not far enough? Because what happens next is going to answer that question in a way none of these passengers expected. Carol had set down the dead interphone and was standing very still in the galley. She was looking at Naomi with an expression that had traveled a significant distance from where it had started. It was not yet an apology, but it was somewhere in the same territory as understanding beginning to dawn slowly that she had made a calculation tonight based on factors she could not write in any official report, and that the calculation had been wrong in a way that was going to be very hard to walk back from. The cockpit door opened. Captain Paul Greer stepped out with a heavy flashlight in his left hand, a paper checklist folded under his right arm, and the expression of a man who has spent 28 years being the most competent person in any emergency, and has in the last 60 seconds encountered a category of emergency he does not have a procedure for. He was 55 with silver hair cut close and the upright bearing of someone who had been military long enough that it had become structural. He stopped when he saw the cabin, the emergency lighting the dead screens, the various states of distress among his passengers, and ran a rapid, trained assessment. His eyes moved past Carol, past Hollis, past James Whitfield and Sophia and Maya. They stopped on Naomi Cole, the woman sitting calmly in the emergency light with a matte black phone in her lap. "Who are you?" he said, "and what happened to my plane?" The question had authority behind it, not aggressive authority. The authority of competence of a man who was in charge of this aircraft and was asking a direct question because he required a direct answer. Hollis stepped forward before Naomi could speak. "Captain, I've been trying to tell the crew. This woman made a phone call and then the power died. She's been disrupting boarding since before the door was sealed. She's claiming some kind of authority over the—" "Mr.?" Greer said. "Hollis, Derek Hollis, Hollis Meridian Capital." Mr. Hollis Greer said, his voice perfectly calibrated. "Sit down." It was not a request. Hollis sat down. The act of sitting down in front of a cabin full of witnesses did something to the geometry of the situation that was difficult to fully quantify, but immediately visible. Hollis settled into the seat he had occupied for the last 40 minutes, the seat with the wrong number on it, and looked smaller than he had looked in it before. Greer moved to the center of the aisle and looked at Naomi. "Ma'am, tell me what's happening." "I initiated a Level 4 compliance diagnostic on your VX nav system," Naomi said. "I'm authorized to do so." Greer's expression moved through two stages. The first was the expression of a man hearing a technical term he knows but did not expect to hear in this context. The second was the expression of a man whose brain is rapidly connecting this information to the VX nav vendor lockout code that had appeared on his flight management system display approximately 70 seconds ago. He had been flying for 28 years. He had never seen that code. "Who authorized you?" "I authorized myself. My name is Naomi Cole, Vertex Aerosystems." Greer knew that name. Every commercial pilot who had been flying for the last 8 years knew that name the way engineers know the names of the people who designed the systems they depend on. VaxNav had become, in the time since its integration into the major carriers, the kind of software infrastructure that you thought about the same way you thought about the atmosphere, not constantly, just whenever you needed it not to fail. He pulled the radio from his shoulder. "Tower. This is Stratus 114. We are showing full electrical bus suspension and a VX nav vendor lockout code. FMS has dumped its data load. Never seen this code in 28 years, requesting ground power and priority guidance." The tower's response came back faster than ground control responses usually came, and with a quality in the voice that Greer had not heard from tower operators more than 2 or 3 times in his career. "Stratos 114. Hold position. Do not depart. We have a priority directive incoming from FAA Regional and Stratus International Headquarters. We have been instructed, do not touch your flight computers. Do not deplane any passengers. A Stratos representative is en route to the jet bridge now. Greer lowered the radio. The cabin, which had found its own equilibrium of tense quiet, went a degree quieter still. The words FAA Regional and Headquarters had the effect of transforming what had seemed until 30 seconds ago like an unusual boarding incident into something with different dimensions, from 2C. Sophia's phone caught Greer's expression as he processed the tower's message. The live stream now showed 8,400 viewers. The comments from what Sophia could see at the edge of her peripheral vision were moving too fast to read. Hollis said from Seat 1A, the FAA over a seat dispute. His voice was trying to find somewhere comfortable and failing. This has to be disproportionate. This can't be about... Mr. Hollis, Greer said, not looking at him. I asked you to sit down. Hollis was already sitting. The instruction this time was shorthand for something else. Greer turned back to Naomi. Ms. Cole, I need to understand the full scope of this. Level 4. What does that mean for my aircraft? It means the diagnostic is running a full handshake verification between VXNav and your flight management system. It takes between 8 and 14 minutes. During that window, everything non-essential is suspended. Your engines are fine. Your structural systems are fine. You're not in danger. But you cannot depart, and you cannot override the process from inside the aircraft. She met his eyes directly. To end the diagnostic early, the authorization has to come from me. Greer was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Carol, he said without turning. Carol said from the galley captain. What happened before the power went out, the beginning? All of it. Carol hesitated. It was a 3-second hesitation. And it said in those 3 seconds everything it needed to say about the relative reliability of the account Carol was about to give. Marco Reyes stepped forward from the galley entrance. Captain, I can give you the sequence. Greer looked at Marco, nodded. Marco gave the sequence. He was precise, factual, and chronological. He did not editorialize. He stated what the manifest showed when Carol had confirmed it, what Carol had decided to do with that information. How many times Naomi had requested the correct action, what Hollis had said during the boarding process, and in what order all of these things had occurred. He reported it the way you report something that the record will need to be clear on. When he finished, Greer looked at the boarding pass that was still sitting on the console of Seat 1A. The number 3B was visible from where he stood. He looked at Naomi. Is his account accurate? Yes, Naomi said. Greer looked at Hollis. Mr. Hollis, is it accurate? Hollis looked at the boarding pass, at Greer, at the faces watching him from around the cabin. There was a verbal agreement. Yes or no, Mr. Hollis? Is the account accurate? A beat. The seat on my pass is 3B, Hollis said. Yes. The admission landed in the cabin without drama. It was not a confession delivered under theatrical pressure. It was a man saying the only thing left that was true in a tone that suggested he was still trying to decide how damaging that true thing was. Greer looked at the overhead panels. Dark. At the galley. Dark. At the 300 people sitting in the warm and increasingly uncomfortable cabin, most of whom were on their phones, most of whose phones were transmitting. He turned to Carol. You confirmed her name on the manifest and didn't act on it. Carol said nothing. Marco, yes, Captain. Stay with Ms. Cole, whatever she needs. It was not a long sentence. But in the architecture of this aircraft, in this moment, in this cabin, it was a sentence that meant something. It meant that a line had been drawn, and that Greer was standing on a specific side of it. Carol heard it. The effect on her face was complicated. Naomi heard it. James Whitfield heard it and gave a single small nod. Maya heard it and closed her eyes briefly. Sophia's camera caught all of it. Greer looked at Naomi one more time. And in his expression was something that had not been there when he first stepped out of the cockpit. It was not quite apology. It was not quite acknowledgement. It was the look of a man who has been in a position of authority long enough to recognize when he sees it someone else who holds a different kind of authority, and is adjusting his assessment accordingly. The representative from headquarters will be here in approximately 4 minutes, he said. I'll be in the cockpit when they arrive, whatever they need. He went back through the door. The cabin settled into a new configuration of silence. Not the silence of before, which had been the silence of unresolved tension, but the silence of a situation that has found its shape. The emergency lighting still ran its flat white lines along the floor. The air was warm and getting warmer. Outside, through the oval windows, JFK's tarmac lights blurred in the rain. In seat 1, a Derek Hollis sat with his boarding pass in his hand and his champagne gone flat, and his face a composition that no longer had enough material in it to be composed. In seat 2, a Naomi Cole sat with her hands in her lap and waited. She was very good at waiting. In the dark cabin with the flat emergency light running along the floor, and the rain still driving against the windows, Naomi sat with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to be alone in a crowd. She had been 33 years old. Vertex Aero had 41 employees, 3 regional contracts, and the beginning of something that was starting to feel less like a startup and more like a structure. VXNav was in the middle of its first major institutional integration test. She had not slept more than 5 hours consecutively in 4 months. The Aviation Innovation Summit in Dallas was the largest industry conference of the year. 800 attendees, every major carrier, represented the kind of room where the contracts that would matter in 5 years' time were decided over catered lunches and deliberate handshakes. Naomi had been invited to speak. 20 minutes on the main stage. She had prepared for 8 weeks. She wore a black blazer. She wore her best shoes. She had her slide deck memorized. The room was what she had expected. Mostly men, mostly a particular demographic of men. She had been in enough rooms by then to stop being surprised by the configuration and instead simply map it on entry the way you map exits in any unfamiliar space. She gave the talk. It went well. She could tell it went well from the quality of the silence in the room. The attentiveness, the notes being taken the specific moment in slide 11 when she could see in the front rows the recalculation happening in real time. She had built the argument carefully enough that the recalculation was unavoidable. You couldn't listen to the logic and not follow it to where it led. When she finished, the applause was real, not polite, real. The moderator, a man in his mid-50s who had been in aviation for decades and was the sort of person who was introduced at every conference as a legend of the industry, came up to shake her hand. "Great presentation," he said warmly. "Very surprising." She thanked him. "Did you have help putting it together?" He said it the way you say something you don't intend to be cutting and therefore say without thinking, which meant he said it without the defenses that intentional cruelty would have had. It landed cleanly. Every word Naomi said, every slide, every line of code behind it. Right. He was already scanning the room for the next handshake. "Well, hopefully the big players give it a fair look." She smiled, nodded, stepped down from the stage. In the hallway outside the conference room, she stood at a window for approximately 30 seconds and allowed herself to feel exactly what she was feeling, which was her practice, to feel it accurately rather than manage it into something more convenient. Then she folded it and put it somewhere she could access later in smaller doses. A voice behind her, "Ms. Cole." She turned. A young woman in her mid-20s. Dark hair. Quick eyes, the slight formality of someone who is still learning when formality is required and when it isn't. She was wearing a conference badge that said, Navarro S., attendee. "I'm an intern at Mesa Coastal," she said. I wanted to say, I've been in aviation for 2 years, and I've never seen anyone on that stage who looked like me or like you." She stopped, started again. "Thank you for being up there." Naomi looked at her for a moment. "What's your name?" "Sophia Navarro." Back in the cabin in the emergency light, Naomi looked up slowly and found seat 2C. Sophia Navarro, travel journalist, 31 years old, not an intern anymore, had lowered her phone to her knee. She was looking at Naomi with an expression that held in its complexity the entire distance between that hallway in Dallas 8 years ago and this cabin tonight. "You remember me," Sophia said quietly. "I never forgot," Naomi said. A beat. Sophia raised the phone again, but her free hand, the one not holding the phone, rested flat against her chest for just a moment as if steadying something. Then the jet bridge door opened. The sound was a thud against the aircraft door. The boarding bridge reconnecting the hollow clunk of metal on metal that carries differently when the cabin is quiet enough to hear everything. From the economy section, someone called out, "Finally." The voice had the compressed hope of 200 people who had been sitting in the heat and the dark for 14 minutes. The door opened. The man who came through it was not airport police. He was not a TSA officer. He was not the security presence that Derek Hollis had been anticipating with the confidence of a man who was certain that when authority arrived, it would arrive on his side. He was wearing a gray suit and carrying a briefcase in the wrong hand, left hand swinging awkward like he'd grabbed it without looking. And he was moving at a pace that corporate men in gray suits almost never move, which was approximately 1 step from a full run. His hair was slightly displaced. There was perspiration at his temple. Behind him came a woman in a Stratos operations uniform, station manager insignia, an expression that suggested she had aged visibly in the last 20 minutes. The man came through the first-class curtain and stopped. His eyes ran around the cabin with the rapid inventory of someone looking for a specific person in a specific situation they have received information about but not yet seen. His eyes bypassed Derek Hollis. They bypassed Captain Greer, who had come back out of the cockpit when he heard the door. They went directly to seat 2A and the woman sitting in it with her hands folded in her lap and the second phone resting on her knee. Ms. Cole. He was slightly out of breath. Please. I'm Victor Solis, VP of Northeast Operations, Stratos International. I got here as fast as I could. I'm so sorry. Your COO called us and He stopped, steadied himself, ran a hand across his forehead. I need to speak with you urgently. The cabin observed this. It observed the VP of Northeast Operations for one of the largest transatlantic carriers on the eastern seaboard arrive at this aircraft in something approaching a run and address the woman in the gray hoodie and worn sneakers with an urgency that made no sense unless the woman in the gray hoodie was something other than what she had appeared to be for the last 47 minutes. Derek Hollis was watching Victor Solis with the focused attention of a man doing very rapid reassessment. The specific thing he was reassessing was the way Victor Solis looked at Naomi, not the way you look at a difficult passenger, not the way you look at someone causing a problem, the way you look at someone who has the power to define whether this situation becomes your worst professional memory or something you recover from, and who currently has no particular reason to choose the recovery option. It was the look of a man who is afraid. It had nothing to do with the hoodie. It had nothing to do with the jeans or the worn sneakers or the messenger bag. It had everything to do with the matte black phone on her knee, Miss Cole Victor said, and his voice had come down from its initial rush to something more controlled, but no less urgent. The Level 4 diagnostic. I understand why you initiated it. I understand completely. But the cascade, we need to talk about the cascade. If the process runs to full completion, we lose Boston, Logan, Philadelphia International, and the Mid-Atlantic routing hub within 18 minutes. It's a daisy chain effect through the transponder system. We're already seeing the beginning of it. Captain Greer stepped forward. Victor looked at him. Who is she? Victor Solis looked at Paul Greer, the captain, a man of 28 years and considerable competence, with the expression of a man who cannot quite believe that this question is being asked. Captain Victor said, This is Naomi Cole. She is the founder and CEO of Vertex Aerosystems. No response from Greer yet. Waiting. She owns VexNav. Victor said each word placed with deliberate weight. The navigation platform, the fuel efficiency algorithm, the routing matrix that your dispatch system runs on, the scheduling software that Stratus uses to manage 340 daily departures. Every aircraft in our fleet, every single one, operates using code that this woman wrote. He looked at Naomi. She literally built the infrastructure that allows us to fly. The cabin was completely silent. Not the silence of shock exactly, though shock was part of it. More the silence of a room in which a sentence has been spoken that changes the physical properties of the space, as if the air had rearranged itself around new information and hadn't settled yet. Derek Hollis's champagne glass, still on the console, still full gone flat and ignored during the last 20 minutes of crisis, fell. Not thrown, not slapped away, just fell. Knocked by his hand, which had moved involuntarily as something in him reacted before his brain finished forming the response. The glass hit the carpet with a soft, final sound that the cabin's silence made very audible. Hollis said in a voice that bore almost no resemblance to the voice that had been operating in this space for the last hour. She's wearing a hoodie. No one responded to this. Naomi turned her gaze to Derek Hollis. She looked at him the way you look at something you have been carrying for a long time and have decided tonight to set down. Yes, Mr. Hollis, she said. I'm wearing a hoodie. She let that sit. I was wearing one at 17 when they told me the cleaning staff entrance was around the back. Her voice was level, not performed, not for the camera or the live stream or the people watching in the cabin. Just true. I was wearing one at 26 when they sent a junior analyst to meet with me instead of a partner, because they'd made a decision about what I was based on, what I looked like before I reached the elevator. I was wearing one at 33 when a man who was supposed to introduce me at the biggest conference of my career asked if I'd had help putting together my own presentation. She paused. I wear what I'm comfortable in. I have always worn what I'm comfortable in, and every single time I have walked into a room in this hoodie, I have been exactly who I am. You simply chose not to see it. The silence held. Victor Solis had a notepad in his hand that he didn't remember taking out. Ms. Cole, he said, name your terms. Victor turned to Carol, who had not moved from the galley entrance since his arrival, and who was watching Naomi with a face that had traveled a very long way in a very short time. You confirmed her assignment on the manifest and chose not to act on it. Carol said, I didn't know. I know you didn't know who she was, Victor said, and his voice held a specific quality of patience through frustration that was its own kind of accusation. That is the point. You looked at her, you looked at him, and you made a decision that had nothing to do with the manifest. That decision grounded this aircraft and contributed to the delay of approximately 400 flights along the eastern seaboard. He looked at Carol directly. I will need your account. In full. In writing. Tonight. Carol looked at the floor. From seat 3. A James Whitfield looked at Hollis. Not with satisfaction. Something more exhausted than that. The look of a man who has watched a predictable thing happen and is tired of how predictable it always is. Sophia's phone was steady. Viewer count 31,000. The comments were not readable at this speed. Marco was standing at the galley entrance with his arms at his sides and his face doing a careful professional job of not showing everything he was feeling, which included, in approximate order, vindication. Relief, a deep and specific gratitude for the fact that he had stood in this aisle and refused to be moved. Naomi looked around the cabin once, at James, at Sophia, at Marco, at Maya, who was sitting in seat 4A with her boarding pass in both hands, and her eyes bright, and her expression containing something that Naomi recognized because she had felt it herself many years ago at a moment when she understood for the first time that the thing she was watching was not inevitable. Then she looked at Victor Solis and his notepad. Let's talk terms, she said. Victor Solis had his pen ready. Around them, the cabin waited. Not restlessly, with a particular kind of attentiveness, the attentiveness of people who understand they are present at something that will not repeat itself. Even economy from behind the curtain had gone quiet. Word had moved through the cabin in the way word moves in closed spaces, whispered past, shaped and reshaped, and what had reached the back was enough for 260 people to understand that something was happening at the front that they did not want to miss. First, Naomi said, Mr. Hollis. She didn't look at him. She addressed Victor, and the choice to not look at Hollis while speaking about him was its own kind of statement. His name and a complete account of tonight's incident gets submitted to Stratos's Global Partner Incident Registry. Any carrier operating VXNav has access to that registry. What they do with the information is their decision, but the record exists, and it is accurate and it is permanent. Victor was writing, done. Hollis stood up. You cannot. That is a private. Sit down, Mr. Hollis, Captain Greer said. He had come back from the cockpit and was standing at the galley entrance, and he said it the same way he had said it before. Without heat, just wait. Hollis sat down. There was something different about the way he sat down this time. Earlier, sitting down had been compliance. Now it was closer to collapse, the slow settling of a structure from which the load-bearing support has been removed. His boarding pass was still in his hand. He seemed to have forgotten it was there. James Whitfield from 3A quiet and certain he should hear all of this. Nobody objected. Second, Naomi said, "Carol Sims," a breath from the galley. "I don't want her fired." Victor looked up from the notepad. Carol's head came up. The surprise on her face was genuine. Not performed, not hopeful theater, but actual surprise, the surprise of someone who had calculated a likely consequence and been told the calculation was wrong. "Firing her is easy," Naomi said. "It produces a clean outcome and it lets the problem become a personnel file instead of a conversation. I don't want a clean outcome, I want a useful one." She looked at Carol directly for the first time since the boarding process. "You go on probationary status. 6 months. You work ground operations, not the air. At the end of 6 months you apply to return through a full retraining program. I will personally review the curriculum of that program." She held Carol's gaze. "You had the information on that screen. You had the authority to act on it. You turned the screen off. Those things are true and you cannot unmake them. But they are not all you are. What you do with them is still in front of you." Carol stood very still. A tear moved down her face. Not the performative kind. The kind that happens when something is accurate and the accuracy reaches somewhere real. She did not wipe it away. She stood with it because she seemed to understand that this was not a moment to manage her face. Third, Naomi said, "Marco Reyes." Marco went very still in the galley entrance. He gets a formal commendation in his employee file. He followed documented protocol when his supervisor told him not to. His account of events tonight was accurate, chronological, and given without editorializing. That kind of integrity is not common. It should be recognized formally, and it should be the standard against which this cabin crew measures itself going forward. Victor was writing. Marco looked at the floor. His expression had not changed, but his shoulders, which had been carrying something tight and invisible since the beginning of this flight, let go of it. Fourth, Naomi said, "Seat 1A." Victor looked up again, uncertain. "I won't be sitting in it." "But Ms. Cole we've removed." "I know what you've removed. The seat is fine. The problem isn't structural." She allowed herself the faintest version of the real smile she almost never showed in rooms like this. "The energy in it is just not something I want for the next 8 hours." She turned, found seat 4A. Maya Torres was sitting with both hands on the armrests and her boarding pass in her lap, and an expression that was trying very hard to be composed and not succeeding in the most genuine and beautiful way. "Maya," Naomi said. The girl blinked, yes. "Take seat 1A. A beat. The champagne is non-alcoholic. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Maya looked at Naomi. A whole conversation moved through her face in about 3 seconds. Surprise, uncertainty, the beginning of understanding something deeper than understanding. And then she stood up. She gathered her boarding pass and her bag with the careful movements of someone trying to be precise when their hands aren't fully cooperating. When she reached seat 1A, she stood at it for a moment before sitting down. She put her hand on the armrest, looked at the flat lie-flat surface, the fresh pillow, the orchid in its small vase that had survived the power outage intact. She sat down. James Whitfield started clapping. Slowly, deliberately. Not the performative applause of a crowd, but the specific considered clapping of a man doing something he means. 2 passengers behind him joined. Then Sophia. Then the man in 2B who had been asleep since takeoff and was still not fully sure what he had woken up into. From behind the curtain in economy, someone started clapping. Then someone else. Then, spreading backward through the aircraft, the way warmth spreads through a cold room, not all at once, but steadily, one person at a time. The sound grew into something full and genuine that lasted for about 15 seconds and then broke into quiet on its own terms. Naomi stood in the center aisle and let it happen. She didn't bow. She didn't raise her hand. She just stood there in her gray hoodie and worn sneakers in the flat white emergency light and let the room do what it needed to do. Then she looked at Victor. "Fifth," she said. "When I land in London, I want a full audit of Stratus's passenger services protocol, not just the boarding procedure, the training that produced it. Because what happened here tonight is not one flight attendant making a bad call. It is the behavior of people who were trained over time to look at certain passengers in a certain way. The training produced the behavior. The training needs to change, Victor wrote. Naomi turned to Hollis one final time. He was sitting in a seat he had occupied by force for the better part of an hour, and that was in approximately 60 seconds, going to require him to find his actual seat, which was 3B, and sit in it for the duration of whatever came next. You told me Naomi said that your meeting was worth $200 million. You told me that made your time worth more than mine. You told me that people like me don't sit here. She looked at him without anger. Something more settled than anger, something that had the quality of a verdict that has already been delivered and does not need to be shouted. I've been building something for 20 years, Mr. Hollis. Seat by seat, contract by contract, flight by flight. Tonight I came here to sleep on my way to the next phase of it. You decided in 30 seconds what I was and what I deserved. She paused. I hope the time you spent in that decision was worth it. Hollis had nothing left. He opened his mouth once, closed it. He looked in that moment like a man who has run out of the material from which he constructs his certainty and is standing in front of an audience with the scaffolding down. Ms. Cole Victor said, pen still in hand. I'm ready when you are. Naomi looked at the phone, raised it to her ear. Dara, she said. Authorization lifted. Reboot via XNav. All systems. Dara's voice crisp and immediate rebooting now. The lights came back. Not gradually. Fully, all at once, the warm gold of the first-class ambient system returning as if it had never left. The air conditioning exhaled its cool breath. The entertainment screens bloomed with the Stratos logo. The galley panels illuminated. The jazz resumed mid-phrase exactly where it had stopped. From economy, 260 people made a collective sound that was somewhere between relief and applause. In the first-class cabin, no one made any sound at all for about 3 seconds. They just looked at the light and breathed the conditioned air and were each of them in whatever private way grateful. Then Marco Reyes said quietly from the galley entrance, Welcome back, everyone. Naomi walked toward the cockpit past Carol, who was standing in the galley and who said nothing. There was nothing yet for Carol to say that was equal to the moment. She knew it. She looked at Naomi with an expression that held in it the beginning of something that would take longer than this flight to complete. Naomi stopped at the galley entrance, leaned in slightly toward Carol. Next time someone hands you a ticket, she said, just check the name. She went forward, knocked twice. The door opened. Captain Greer stepped aside to let her in. Sarah Mendez, the JFK station manager who had arrived behind Victor Solis, had been standing at the forward entrance since the moment of the reboot. She was efficient, professional, and visibly relieved that the portion of this evening requiring her to make consequential decisions appeared to be concluding. Mr. Hollis, Victor said, Sarah will assist you. You'll need to collect your carry-on. Your checked bags will be offloaded at the gate. Hollis looked at Victor. The look was not the look of a man preparing to argue. It was the look of a man who has spent the last 90 minutes performing a version of himself, confident, entitled, architecturally certain, and has arrived at the end of that performance with nothing left to perform. He stood up. He took his carry-on from the overhead compartment. He adjusted his jack at once, a gesture so habitual he did it without awareness. Sarah moved ahead of him toward the economy curtain. He followed. The walk through economy was not what Derek Hollis had imagined when he had boarded this aircraft earlier and arranged himself in first class with his champagne and his tablet and his certainty. He had not imagined walking through the economy section at 11:47 p.m. with his carry-on over his shoulder, while 260 people who had just spent 47 minutes in a dark, warming aircraft watched him go. No one said anything loud. A few people said things quietly. One person near the back said clearly enough to carry, "That's him." The sound that followed was not applause and not booing. It was the particular sound of a group of people who have decided collectively that something has been resolved correctly, and who are expressing this conclusion in the most efficient way available to them, which was silence, shaped like judgment. Hollis did not look back. At the gate agent's desk, his rolling bag was already waiting on a trolley. He sat in a gate chair and turned on his phone. The first thing he saw was a text from his office's managing partner that said, "Call me, now." The second thing he saw was that Twitter was trending #SI114 and #Seat1A, and in third position his own name. He clicked the first video. Sofia Navarro's live stream now recorded and uploaded. The view count said 4.7 million. He watched himself standing over Naomi, with his arm extended, pointing toward economy. He heard himself say in his own voice with his own cadence, "People like you don't sit here." He turned the phone face down. He called the managing partner, Derek. The voice on the other end had no warmth in it anywhere. The Barrington Group pulled out of the Meridian Fund. Not reduced. Out. Tonight. Their managing director watched the video. A pause. The Omni Logistics deal. Their CEO sent an email to the board. The deal is closed. Not renegotiating. Closed. I can get to London by morning. There is no morning meeting, Derek. There is no deal. And the board has asked me to relay that your position is under review. He hung up. He sat in the gate chair and looked at the departure board. SI114. London Heathrow was now showing boarding resumed. Through the terminal windows, he could see the aircraft on the tarmac, its lights on its engines beginning their pre-departure cycle. The blue glow at the edge of each nacelle exactly as it had been when he boarded. He walked to the Stratus counter. "I need a ticket to London. Any cabin. Economy is fine." The agent typed his name. The screen produced a red box. "I'm sorry, sir," the agent said, her voice professionally empty of judgment. "I'm unable to process this ticket. Your name is showing a global partner incident flag across all Oneworld and Star Alliance carriers. I can't override it at the gate level." "How long?" "It says the duration is under review by the Vertex Aerosystems compliance team." He stood at the counter for a moment. Derek Hollis, who had flown this route 6 times a year for 12 years, who had a Diamond Elite card and a firm conviction that rooms arranged themselves around his needs, turned from the Stratos counter and walked back into the general terminal. He would take a car service to Manhattan, 2.5 hours in traffic, like everyone else. He did not look back at the gate. Behind the terminal windows, Stratos International SY114 was pushing back from the gate, its engines rising to the familiar sound of departure, the blue of the VX nav indicators steady at the wing roots. On board in seat 1. Amaya Torres sat with her hands on the armrests and looked out the oval window at the rain-blurred lights of JFK falling away beneath them. She pressed her boarding pass flat on the console in front of her. She was going to keep it. The cockpit was small in the way that cockpits are small. Not cramped, but intimate, every instrument and surface placed with the precision of a space where there is no room for anything non-essential. The rain against the windshield had softened as they taxied, and by the time they reached the runway threshold, it had stopped. Naomi sat in the jump seat behind Captain Greer and First Officer Davis. "VX nav is running clean," she said. The reset cleared out a backlog of unprocessed error flags, small inefficiencies that had been accumulating since the last maintenance cycle. "Your fuel efficiency is running about 3% better than before the diagnostic." Greer was looking at the runway ahead. He said, "How many passengers land and don't know that the plane they just flew on is running your software?" "All of them," Naomi said. That was always the point. When it's working right, you don't know it's there. Seems like a strange thing to spend 20 years building, something invisible. She thought about that for a moment. "Most of the things that keep us safe are invisible," she said. "Until they're not." Greer was quiet for a moment. They lined up on the runway. The engines built their sound. "I owe you an apology," he said. "When I came out of that cockpit, I saw a difficult passenger and a confused situation. I was already deciding who was the problem before I heard the facts. It should not have taken that long." "You corrected it," Naomi said. "And when you did, you acted on it. That's the part that matters." The wheels left the ground. A knock at the cockpit door. Greer nodded. Davis opened it. Marco Reyes stood in the door with 2 cups of coffee. He held one out to Naomi. She took it. "Marco," she said, "why did you speak up when Carol told you not to?" He thought about it with the genuine consideration the question deserved. "My mother worked as a cabin cleaner for an airline for 22 years, he said. "She told me once, the worst thing you can do on an airplane is pretend you don't see something that's wrong. Because everyone is in the same aircraft. Whatever happens to one person happens in some way to all of them." Naomi looked at him. "Tell your mother she said that she raised someone good." Marco smiled once genuinely, then went back to the cabin. The aircraft broke through the cloud layer, and the sky above was clear and dark and enormous, scattered with stars that had been invisible from the ground. Ahead of them, over the curve of the earth, London was asleep and waiting. Naomi closed her eyes. She had earned this seat a long time ago. She had simply tonight taken it back. 6 months later, the apartment Derek Hollis was living in would not have been described by the people who had known him before as an apartment Derek Hollis would live in. The elevator worked 3 days out of 5. The view from the living room window was a brick wall, and above it a narrow strip of sky through which, on clear days, the contrails of aircraft were visible if you looked at the right angle. Derek looked at them sometimes. He had more time to look at them now. The sequence of consequences had unfolded with the efficient thoroughness of something that had been building for a long time and needed only a single public event to become visible. The Barrington Group's withdrawal had been followed by 2 other institutional investors citing reputational concerns. The board had placed him on administrative leave pending investigation. The investigation had found in the process of reviewing his professional conduct other things that had been buried for years. He was sitting at a table in a kitchen that received late afternoon light until about 4 o'clock when it left. On the laptop screen, an article from a business magazine. He had been reading it for 10 minutes without making it past the first paragraph, because the first paragraph contained a photograph that had arrested his attention. The photograph was taken on a tarmac. The subject was standing in front of a commercial aircraft, looking up at a point above the camera, with an expression that was not triumphant and not posed. It was simply the expression of a person who is exactly where they are supposed to be. The headline above it, Time Magazine, Person of the Year, Naomi Cole, the woman who rewired the industry. He read the article slowly. He read about Vertex Aero's expanded partnership agreements. He read about the training protocols now being implemented across 41 carriers. He read about the scholarship program she had founded. He got to the end. He set the laptop screen to dim and sat in the light that was still coming through the kitchen window. He thought about the moment on the plane when she had said, "You simply chose not to see it." He had been thinking about that sentence off and on for 6 months. Not with the defensive energy he had brought to it initially. That energy had worn itself out somewhere around month 3. What remained now that the noise had cleared was just the sentence. And the accuracy of it. He had chosen. He had chosen in 30 seconds based on a hoodie and a pair of worn sneakers and a reading of a situation that he had performed with absolute confidence and gotten completely wrong. Outside the kitchen window, through the gap between buildings, a commercial aircraft crossed the narrow strip of sky. The blue indicator at the edge of each engine was briefly visible as it passed. The VXNAV signature, the color that meant the software was running. Derek Hollis watched it until it was gone. Then he turned back to the laptop. He moved the cursor to the article, found the share button, did not write a caption, did not add a comment, just clicked the like button. A small, quiet action in a dark kitchen on a November afternoon that no one would see and no one would know about. Then he closed the laptop. The kitchen went quiet. The last of the afternoon light lay flat against the wall. Outside, somewhere above the buildings and the clouds and the November weather, another aircraft was climbing. He didn't look up to find it. 3 months after SI-1, 1-4. Carol Sims was sitting in seat 34C on a domestic flight from Atlanta to Detroit, sitting there as a passenger. Not in uniform, not with the authority of the aisle, just a middle seat in economy with a paper cup of complimentary water. The woman in seat 34B was in her early 40s, black, wearing a practical travel outfit. When she settled back, she exhaled and said to no one specifically, "I genuinely hate flying, no matter how many times I do it. I always feel like people are watching me like I shouldn't be here." Carol looked at her. She looked at her the way she had been learning in the last 3 months to look at people, not through the filter of status tier and seat assignment and the unconscious arithmetic of belonging. Just looking. She saw a woman who was tired and a little anxious, and going somewhere the same as everyone else. "I used to be one of those people," Carol said. "The ones watching. I'm trying not to be anymore." The woman glanced at her, surprised by the candor. Then she nodded once, as if she had received something she hadn't expected and was deciding what to do with it. They didn't talk for the rest of the flight, But Carol sat with what she had said. She sat with it the way she was learning to sit with things. Not managing them into something more comfortable, but letting them be what they were. She had been thinking about Naomi Cole's words for 3 months. Not the words that had been said in confrontation. The words that had been said at the end in the galley, quiet enough to be private. Next time someone hands you a ticket, just check the name. The simplicity of it. Not a condemnation, not a lesson, just the next thing. The minimum required, just check the name. She had been checking names. On the flight back to Atlanta, she took out her phone, opened the Stratus internal portal, found the application she had been looking at for 2 weeks without submitting. Application lead trainer diversity and inclusion, new hire orientation program. She pressed submit. The confirmation screen appeared. She closed the app. Out the window, the sun was at the angle where it turns the clouds into something worth looking at, all that flat light going horizontal and gold. Carol looked at it for a while. She thought about a girl in seat 4A with a boarding pass held too tight and eyes that had seen everything that happened that night and filed it somewhere she would carry forward. She hoped the girl was doing well. She thought she probably was. London in May. The Aviation Innovation Summit had been held for 11 years in the same conference center near Canary Wharf. 9 years ago, Naomi Cole had given a 20-minute presentation in this building, and a moderator had asked her on her way off the stage if she'd had help putting it together. This year she was the keynote speaker. She stood backstage for a moment before they called her out. The ballroom held 1,200 people. She could hear the particular hum of a room that size. Voices, movement, the ambient sound of expectation. She thought about the dormitory in Atlanta, the parking garage in San Francisco, the conference hallway where a young woman named Sophia Navarro had run after her to say something true. She thought about seat 2A on a November flight in the flat white emergency light and the girl in 4A with her boarding pass. She walked out. The applause was the kind you feel before you hear. A year ago, she said, a man looked at me and decided I didn't belong in a seat I had paid for. A ripple of knowing moved through the audience. He made that decision. Naomi continued in about 30 seconds. Based on what I was wearing. Based on what I looked like. Based on everything except the ticket in my hand. She looked at the room. That is not an unusual story. Most people in this room who didn't grow up looking like the traditional image of a person in this industry have a version of that story. Multiple versions. From lobbies, from meetings, from stages like this one. She paused. The cost of those stories is not just personal. When we exclude people from rooms based on how they look, we lose what they carry. We lose the ideas they're not asked for the problems they would solve if anyone thought to ask them. That loss is real. It compounds. She looked down at the front row. 20 young people sat there in neat rows. A range of faces, backgrounds, origins. They were wearing flight suits with the Vertex Aero Foundation logo on the breast pocket. They were the first graduating class of the seat won a scholarship, named not for the seat itself, but for what the seat represented the place you have earned regardless of what anyone else decides about you. And here is what I know Naomi said. The work is long. The rooms that need changing are numerous, and they don't change quickly. There are days when the weight of it is real and the progress is slow, and the same story keeps happening in the same buildings with different names on the door. She found Maya in the front row. Maya Torres was sitting in the third seat from the left, her flight suit crisp, her posture straight, her expression holding the combination of composure and feeling that had been growing in her since the night she had sat in a first-class cabin at 17 and watched a woman in a gray hoodie refuse quietly and completely to move. But here is also what I know Naomi said, and her voice changed. Not louder, just more direct, aimed at something specific. The day I stop, the day I decide the rooms are too many and the progress is too slow, and the cost is too high, is the day everyone who told me I didn't belong was right about me. She held Maya's eyes for a moment, and they were never right. After the ceremony in the hallway outside the ballroom, Naomi found Maya. Maya was already there, standing at the window, looking at the Thames below. The dark water, the lit bridges, a tourist boat crossing from one bank to the other with its lights trailing. Do you ever get tired of fighting? Maya asked. She didn't look away from the window when she said it. Naomi stood next to her. Every single day, she said. Maya nodded slowly. Then how do you keep going? Naomi thought about the dormitory key handed over without apology, the parking garage and the pitch deck on her knees, the moderator's question with its cheerful, oblivious blade, the seat on Xi 114 and the 47 minutes in the emergency light, and the phone with one number saved in it. She thought about the notebook, the sentence on the first page of every one. Because the day I stop, she said, is the day they were right about me, and they were never right. Maya was quiet for a moment. Then she looked down at her feet. New shoes bought with the first scholarship installment, good ones chosen with care. I applied for the junior analyst program at Vertex Aero, she said, for after graduation. Naomi looked at her. I know, she said. I approved the application. Maya's head came up. She looked at Naomi with an expression that moved through surprise and into something warmer, something that had at its edges the beginning of the particular kind of confidence that comes not from being told you're capable, but from being shown by someone who had no obligation to show it, that your presence in a room is not a concession but a fact. They stood at the window for another minute. The boat on the Thames had reached the other bank. The bridges held their lights against the dark water. Outside, somewhere above the city, a navigation light traced a slow arc across the sky. An aircraft beginning its descent toward Heathrow, the instruments in its cockpit processing in real time the code that kept it on course, invisible until it wasn't. Some people spend their whole lives trying to take up less space. Naomi Cole had spent hers making sure the next girl didn't have to. If this story moved you, if you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told you didn't belong somewhere you had every right to be, then this one is for you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Hit that like button if Naomi's story deserves to be seen by more people, because it does. And subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story like this one. Drop a comment below and tell us. Which moment hit you the hardest? Was it when the lights went out? When Maya took seat 1A, or that final conversation by the Thames? We read every single one. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.